In the 13th century, Marco Polo made his journey into the far-off lands of Asia, and there he met incredible people and spent time in foreign courts and explored foreign lands. While he wasn't the first European to make that trip, his story was told far and wide thanks to the publication of his adventures. And while he was traveling through a land where descendants of Genghis Khan still ruled parts of what once had been the world's largest empire, one person in particular impressed him. A person whose story seems to be right out of a fairy tale. In the 1260s, Marco Polo met the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan, and she impressed him as a great warrior. It is history that deserves to be remembered. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The name we know him by today was actually not his name at all, but instead a title, Khan meaning universal ruler. His name was Temujin. He left the empire to his third son, Ogedei, after the two older sons had a terrible brawl. Ogedei further expanded the empire, his forces even reaching Eastern Europe before he died in 1241. His death led to some internal strife. His widow ruled the empire as regent for 5 years and ignored Ogedei's chosen heir. In addition, Batu, ruler of the far western Golden Horde, refused to go to Mongolia, which lengthened Ogedei's widow's regency until her eldest son was elected. He was finally crowned in 1246 and died 2 years later, marching towards the Golden Horde. This finally split the empire. Batu nominated his own choice, a grandson of Genghis, through one of his other sons, and the ruler in Mongolia refused to recognize him, claiming that only descendants through Ogedei could inherit the empire. These disputes led to a full break in the empire and several Mongol civil wars. The famous Kublai Khan, who became the nominal great ruler, but really ruled only over the eastern part of the empire and the Yuan dynasty of China. Meanwhile, the Chagadai Khanate in Central Asia passed to Kublai's nephew, Kaidu, who would be more or less constantly at war with Kublai. The Golden Horde continued to rule in the west, while the Ilkhanate ruled in the southwestern part of the empire, including parts of the Middle East, but the central part of the empire remained out of any of their reach. While Kaidu was not officially Khan himself, he ruled as de facto Khan over the region. A grandson of Ogedei, Kaidu's lineage was the defeated one, but he remained powerful despite near constant battle with his neighbors. Despite their animosity, during this period the Silk Road was vital to all four parts of the empire, an integral part of their culture and a significant part of how they maintained the loyalty of local leaders. Kaidu had 14 sons, but by far his favorite child was his daughter, Kublai. Her name means all white in a Mongolian dialect, although she was known to Marco Polo by a Turkic name which means moonlight. The Central Asian Khanate was made up of disaffected nobles and peoples who were often enemies of the other three Khanates. Especially after 1271, when Kublai declared the Chinese-style Yuan dynasty, the Central Asian Mongols increasingly portrayed themselves as the true Mongols, according to Jack Weatherford in The Secret History of the Mongol Queens. The other empires, especially the Yuan and the Ilkhanate in the southwest, adopted more local customs and abandoned much of the Mongolian culture of Genghis Khan's time. In fact, the Central Khanate came to be called Mogolstan, meaning land of the Mongols, although it was not located in the original homeland of Mongolia. Historically, in Mongolian culture, there are three manly skills: horse riding, archery, and wrestling. Mongolian wrestling, called bok, is the most important of the three, and Genghis Khan considered it one of the best ways to keep his army in combat shape. The sport has a deep history, and cave paintings dating to the Neolithic age depict men wrestling surrounded by crowds. Kublai was said to excel in all these Mongol arts and was known as a champion wrestler. Her father heavily relied on her as a warrior and a confidant and granted her a gerai, a heavy medallion of office, which was a sign of her independence and power. Made of silver or gold, the gerai would be an engraved disc or plate worn on a chain, and it stated that it was granted by the Khan under the will of the eternal blue sky. Usually the gerai was a status symbol only reserved for men, and Kublai is one of the only women ever said to have owned one. Rashid al-Din, Persian historian and physician of the Ilkhanate, said that she went around like a boy, likely meant derisively, since his empire was an enemy of hers, but also said that she often went on military campaigns where she performed valiant deeds. According to Marco Polo, during battle she rode at her father's side, but when she saw an opportunity she would make a dash at the host of the enemy and seize some men thereout, as deftly as a hawk pounces on a bird, and carry him to her father, and she did this many a time. This quote has also been translated as saying that she would snatch a captive as easily as a hawk snatches a chicken. Although the relationship between Kaidu and Khutulun might seem odd, Weatherford argues that in some ways their cooperative work probably reflected that of Genghis Khan and his daughters. Although she had 14 brothers, all of whom served their father was said to be most pleased by her abilities. Kaidu fought at the head of an army of around 40,000 and fought often. From 1268 until Kaidu's death in 1301, his armies fought on the borders against Kublai in China and controlled territory to the east as far as the traditional capital of the Mongols at Karakoram. Marco Polo wrote that he does not obey the Khan, but is rather perpetually at war with him. Much of the fighting between Kaidu and Kublai came from the Genghis-era law that every branch of the family had to agree to grant the title of Great Khan. Kaidu and his allies in the central Khanate were a constant reminder to Kublai that, though he claimed the title, he lacked the universal approval Genghis had deemed necessary. Khutulun's most famous story is related by Polo in his travels. Her father wished to marry her to a baron, but she refused to even unite herself to anyone who could not vanquish her in a fair combat. The king granted her this privilege. She rejoiced that greatly and published through various parts of the world that if any gentle youth would come, try her in pitched battle and gain the victory, she would accept him for their lord. By pitched battle, Khutulun meant wrestling. It was common for the nobles and other onlookers to bet on the outcome of these wrestling matches, and according to Polo, if the men who wrestled her lost, they were to give her 100 horses. Thus, Polo continues, she had gained above 10,000 steeds, because she could find no youth or damsel who could overcome her. Khutulun was described as beautiful and large, tall, and well-formed in her limbs. Indeed, almost a giantess. Weatherford, in his Secret History of the Mongol Queen, says that stories of women warriors appear often enough in the histories of Asia and the steppes that they should not be considered an anomaly. He argues that the primary reason was because of the Central Asian reliance on horse archery. Mounted on a horse and armed with a bow and arrows, a trained and experienced woman warrior could hold her own against men. With a sword, men could to an extent substitute training for brute force, but no amount of strength could replace skill in shooting. Women were largely expected to learn how to use a bow from a young age to help in protecting herds from predators. European sources, while definitely not unbiased, frequently refer to women warriors from the steppes. In the 1230s, a Dominican friar reported that a Mongol princess led a Mongol army headed for Europe. While often difficult to attach to a particular woman, Khutulun appears in both Muslim and Christian sources, as well as traditional oral history. Around 1280, Polo described the arrival of a prince with a brilliant retinue and 1,000 very fine horses to bet on the bout. Polo says that the prince was young and handsome, fearless and strong, and Khutulun's parents even sought to convince her to throw the match and marry the man. Khutulun declared she would not do so for anything in the world. On the day of the match, the two rushed together and wrestled violently, dragging each other in various directions, but at last the lady prevailed and threw him on the ground, to the great grief of all the spectators. Great indeed was his shame and discomfiture. No one, says Weatherford, had seen a woman who could wrestle like Khutulun. Through all these victories, she is said to have earned a herd of 10,000 horses. And it's not clear if that's a literal number or if it simply means a whole lot of horses, but her herd would have rivaled that of the Great Khan. Rumors abounded about Khutulun thanks to her unusual behavior. Some suggested that she would marry Ilkhan Ghazan, ruler of the Ilkhanate, although that likely would have meant leaving the steppe and adopting Islam. Detractors suggested that she had entered into an incestuous relationship with her father and so wouldn't marry. It was these rumors that finally prompted her to marry. According to some of the chronicles, she chose to marry a man called Abdakul of the Koros clan. This Abdakul, according to one story, had been sent to assassinate Kaidu. When he failed, his mother offered to be punished in his place, and in turn, Abdakul refused to let his mother accept the punishment. Supposedly, Kaidu found this display so impressive that he made Abdakul an officer. After being wounded in battle against Kublai Khan, Khutulun met him while he recovered and fell in love with him. Weatherford says the chronicles are quite clear. She chose him herself for the husband. There is some disagreement among sources about who she married, and it isn't clear how accurate the story of the would-be assassin-turned-officer is. Marriage didn't stop Khutulun from campaigning with her father, and she was likely with him in 1301 when Kaidu again sought to capture Karakoram, a valuable symbol, although it was largely abandoned. According to one chronicler, Kaidu was outnumbered 100 to 1 in the battle against Kublai's successor. Faced with defeat, he had his soldiers light many torches. In fact, he was replicating an earlier strategy employed by Kublai in a battle fought very near the same place. The idea was to create the impression that reinforcements had arrived. But instead of attacking, Kaidu, wounded, ordered his men to withdraw. while the Yuan forces hesitated as they weren't sure what kind of ruse was being employed and didn't want to walk into a trap. Kaidu's injuries worsened, and he died in 1301. For the rest of her life, Khutulun would look after his tomb. Some sources say that Kaidu thought enough of his daughter to attempt to name her the next Khan, though she had little support within the family. She, however, was not interested and said that she was desirous of leading the military and running affairs, and supported her brother, Horus, as Khan. Persian chronicler Rashid ad-Din disapproved of Khutulun's involvement in politics and reported that her brothers and other contenders were angered by the idea that she be elevated to Khan. "You should mind your scissors and needles," one supposedly said, and another demanded, "What have you to do with kingship and chieftainship?" It's unclear what her exact actions following her father's death were, though a chronicle records that she continued stirring up sedition and strife. Unfortunately, she died only a few years after her father, in 1306. How she died is uncertain, as some reports claim she died in battle, while others say she was assassinated, both realistic possibilities. Khutulun is believed to have inspired the fictional story of Turandot, which appears in a 1710 book of tales and fables by a French biographer using Asian themes. He wrote of Turandot, meaning Turkish daughter, as a daughter of Kaidu. Instead of wrestling, she challenged the suitors to answer 3 riddles, and if they failed, they would die. This probably follows an otherwise unrelated tale that predates Khutulun from a Persian poet, which tells of Turandot's riddles. 50 years later, this was made into a play by Carlo Gozzi, which was eventually made into an opera by Puccini. Probably the most famous version, although the exact nature of the tales and their setting changed in each. Khutulun has since appeared in many other pieces of media, including the Netflix show Marco Polo. The story of Khutulun strikes many as being incredible, perhaps even mythical, but across time and chroniclers of many different backgrounds, her story remains substantially the same, although it's only told in snippets and seems to sometimes include legendary powers. Still, she was undoubtedly a very real person, and regardless of the specifics, she must have struck an imposing figure. In the secret history of the Mongol queens, Weatherford dubs Khutulun the last of the wild Mongol women. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.